Good morning. First of all, I don't know how many years it is that I've been invited to speak at CiRCE, but it's getting on to a decade maybe. And I just want to thank the Kerns, because it's all of them, for what they've created. It's if you've been with them along the road, you know there were some hard times not that long ago, and after 2008 and so forth and so on, and one wondered if it wouldn't be reduced to their own household, but it didn't happen that way. It's wonderful. It's a revolution. There's no question about it, and you're part of it. And go get them for the sake of the children. What was that? You all hear me okay? Now I recall that almost in every instance where I've given a talk like this, I've had a text, which is not my normal style, not in the classroom certainly. I tend to be feel limited by a text because they would have filled me with all kinds of drugs as a kid, because I can't stand in one place for very long, and reading a text gets irritating. But I do it, and there are reasons for having a text. Today I don't have a text. I do have some notes. Most times I still write into a little pad. It feels better. But I don't know how much these notes will even guide me. I remember the only time I did speak off notes was probably the first time I spoke at CiRCE, which was on my article, which was relatively fresh then, called Dorm Brothel. More recently, my good friend and colleague Bill Wilson and I penned another article called Sex and Danger at UVA. You might want to look at it if you really want to get depressed. Anyhow, Wind in the Willows is in my book, Tending the Heart of Virtue. It's in a chapter entitled Friends and Mentors. There are 3 books in that chapter, and I describe them as in a kind of continuum from a story about pure friendship, which I would say is Wind in the Willows, toward a relationship which might include friendship, but is more mentoral and in character. So I moved from Wind in the Willows to Charlotte's Web to Bambi. Why did I pick Wind in the Willows? Why do I say Wind in the Willows is about more pure friendship? Because each of the characters has a lot to contribute in a fashion of mutuality and concord that I think describes what a real friendship is about. Each has his gifts, whether it's mole or rat or toad or badger. It's not sameness that brings them together, but they are on a relatively equal plane. It's also the case that there's degrees of maturity and immaturity in the characters, and Mole, you might say, is the youngest of the characters. But by the end of the story, they're all pretty much on an equal plane. And in fact, Mole turns out to be the best general to take back Toad Hall from the Stouts and other unsavory creatures, weasels that are having a good time in Toad Hall. Wind in the Willows is what now? It's 110, almost 100, I think 1917 will make it 110 years old. When I first introduced it in the classroom, I wondered how college students would take to it, because the speech, the language is distinctively late Victorian, early Edwardian, and that seems millennia from where we are now, where grunting is probably all you need to do uh, maybe with different accents and reflections. Still grunting. Um, but I discovered that the students had great patience with that and just really loved the book. I think it was because it is about friendship. And I think that in college, probably you make your best friendships, at least in our culture. If not in high school, then in college. Uh, I'm going to be going down to Florida in October, where my fraternity brothers from the years roughly 1962 through 72 will have another reunion. We do it every 2 years. There'll be 45 of us with our spouses, many of whom were pin mates, we used to call them that, girlfriends at the time. So it's really not just the guys. It's so much fun. And I think that a great deal has been lost by not having single-sex schools, because I think that there are bad things and good things to say about single-sex schools, but the good things in the end might outweigh the bad things, given what the unisex university has become. So we have very distinct memories, and having taught at UVA in my later years, a lot of the familiar places are there, but boy, has it changed. For example, if you go through a crossway, there's a voice that tells you when to come and go. You know that the UVA guys back in the mid-1960s wouldn't have tolerated that. There would have been a crew about midnight, 1 o'clock, with bricks, and they would have put them out. It's what would have happened, believe me. Anyway, when Andrew and David contacted me about this project, speaking on home, I said, what do you want me to do? And through David, Andrew spoke to say, why don't you do something on fairy tales? I said, okay, let me think about that. And I guess Wind in the Willows is a good place to land. That's where I landed in any case. I wasn't unaware of the theme of home in thinking about and writing about Wind in the Willows and Tending the Heart. I understood it was there. I think at the end of my discussion of Wind in the Willows, I mentioned how important Toad Hall is for that friendship, and that it has to be retaken in order for that friendship to continue to prosper. I was also aware of the role that home played in the novel itself, and the way that Grahame set things out to actually introduce us to the character of each of the major players, that their homes in some way were a reflection of themselves. And so we learn a lot about them through almost a personification of their homes. And I think that that's true of human life. It's not just true of toads and moles. And it works. So there are 4 homes, and those 4 homes are very important. We're better acquainted with some of those homes than other homes. And I'm going to come to speak a little bit about 2 of the homes, Mole's home and Badger's home. I have an affinity for underground locations, and both of those are underground. It's a good place to hide. I told you I burrow like a worm during the summertime anyhow in the garden. It's barely above ground. The other thing is, when I got to this, I realized that this, among the stories that I've dealt with and thought about over the years, Wind in the Willows is the one that leaves me silent, really. I mean, what's there to say about it that you can't know by savoring it? I mean, seriously. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a lot of analysis of Wind in the Willows, most of which I would advise you to ignore. Well, most of literary criticism on children's literature would be better not written, printed, or read. But um, uh, I'm almost inclined. I was almost inclined to say, why don't I just read a couple of passages and let's talk about them? And that might be what I end up doing. Now, you see, I haven't gotten past my first page of notes, so I don't know what's going to happen, really. In fact, I'm beginning to tremble. Where do I go from here? Um, yeah, uh, the two. Let me say a little bit about this literary criticism. I mean, it makes me angry. I got angry when I was writing Attending the Heart of Virtue, and it was very fortunate because I had an editor at Oxford, the chief editor, Cynthia Reed, who had been an actress before she became editor of Religion and Philosophy. That's interesting, isn't it? And she personally took on the task of reading the manuscript, which is very unusual. Usually they farm it out somewhere. And I had a lot to say about these literary critics in the first drafts. And she told me, just forget the son of a bitch, and just write what you believe, what you think. So all of it got scraped out. Nevertheless, they still continue to irritate me. And Wind in the Willows is no exception. So these critics are always leaning toward one of two paradigms through which they read everything, you say. Well, one is going to be a sociological paradigm, and the other one is what I would call psychobiographical. And they can do all sorts of things with Wind in the Willows when they analyze Wind in the Willows through these windows, but they forget that we're supposed to enjoy the story. I mean, it's amazing. They're much more interested in defending their theory than taking any pleasure in the story, and it happens over and over again. When I was looking about just to see what had been said, I came across an article that I thought might be useful to me. It's written by Mr. Jerry Smith, and it was titled "Finding Home in Wind in the Willows." Wow, this is great. Really. I mean, I'm not chagrined that someone hasn't thought of this before. In fact, I'm grateful for it. The problem is that I got angry instead of. He did give me new insights into the story. They always do in some way or another, even if my insight comes by way of combating them. But Smith adopted both of these techniques, and I don't know, why they must continue in this vein. Now, it is good to know, it seems to me, that Grahame, as a late Victorian and Edwardian, was troubled by the cultural change, the transition of that age, and it was massive. Thus, for example, we're to understand, according to Smith, that the role of Badger and his home in Wind in the Willows is really for Grahame to oppose that change in a manner of speaking. Badger's subterranean dwelling occupies structures from an ancient human settlement. I want to come back to this because I think there's a lot to be thought about, maybe not at the level of a child, but of grown-ups, about how he's created his home and out of which he's created his home. This takes us back to the poetry that we read yesterday, actually. Badger's home, Smith argues, represents the stability and durability of English rural life, and as such it functions as a conservative rejoinder to the social and economic change, industrialization and so forth, classes and so forth, of the time. That's useful. What was happening at the time was that that the rails had taken over, and the rivers were no longer the major means of transportation within the British Isles. So what did they do with the rivers? They turned them into recreational places. If you've ever been to England, you know that. Everyone's on the river still, either rowing, or some people sleep on the river for all summer, and their homes on the water and so forth. And the Grahame is reflecting the great pleasure that one can take in such recreation. And I think he's also warning against the excesses of it, represented in Toad, right? Who indeed is overtaken by mechanization and invention to the point at which he does jeopardize, if not his ancestral home, at least a home in which all of the rest of the river community takes great pride, if Toad doesn't quite, in the manner that they would have him. And so he puts it in great jeopardy. That much I can understand. But really, to begin to then attack Grahame for his reactionary ways, this is when it goes haywire. Or especially in his interest in home. So this gets to the psychobiography. So in writing Wind in the Willows, Smith argues, Grahame was merely, I'm quoting, merely compensating for the childhood he never experienced. As Grahame's mother died when he was young, and he and his siblings were twice abandoned by their dipsomaniac father, who left them in the care of their grandmother, who moved from home to home. That's all true. Okay, so it's good to know. But to try to explain everything about what he's saying about home through that lens is to miss so much of it. So much of it that's really important, I think, even to children. See, what is the attraction of Wind in the Willows to a small child? It's a difficult book. One of the attractions, clearly, is the adventures of Toad. And Disney took advantage of that, and they did this wonderful 45. I don't know how many of you have ever seen that, but I saw it any number of times when Disney came on at 8 o'clock in the evening or 7 on Sunday nights when I was a kid. And I just loved it. It was well done, but it was only a very small part of Wind in the Willows, even though it was called Wind in the Willows. How many of you had seen that? Yeah, that's significant. In my classes, almost none have seen it. That's interesting. Now I can understand why they picked that out, but I wonder if, at least as attractive to a young child, isn't in fact the coziness of the homes, the eating, the revelry, the just easiness, camaraderie that he so ably describes. To merely reduce it to a psychological analysis or some kind of sentimentality based on a lack of one's own experience or woundedness seems to me beside the point. What I'm saying is much of this analysis of these children's stories actually distracts you from what makes them great. And what makes them great is they introduce us to the human condition, even through characters who are not human. And for Grahame, I think these characters were virtually human. In later years, not long before he died, actually, they finally got around to wanting to publish a fully illustrated edition. And he agreed to it, but he wrote back to the editors, he said, you know, I love these people, these little people. Be kind and gentle with them, you know. And they are lovable, after all. And so much of that criticism is blind to fancy or fairy. while it heaps upon us this ponderous social realism and social theory. Even Humphrey Carpenter, whose writing I do appreciate very much, he's written on Lewis, but his book Secret Gardens is well worth a read. Even he seems to feel obliged to devote really an inordinate amount of time to this sort of analysis. For example, he writes that at the other pole of Grahame's escapism, is what he calls it, is Grahame the home lover. That's right, he was a home lover. All those moves from one house to the next in his childhood, Carpenter hypothesizes, must have played a part in his obsession with creating a snug, neat little home for himself, which runs through Wind in the Willows. If that is all that those wonderful descriptions of home life are about in Wind in the Willows, it would not be a great book, would it? So if we dwell on that kind of analysis, we really don't appreciate the imaginative genius of Grahame and the appeal that his story has to children's imaginations. I don't know if you need to be taught these lessons, but I live them because every time I go back and think about, I'm an academic after all, think about writing on one fairy tale or another or talking on one or the other, I do look at to see what's been said about it. I discourage my students from doing so. Well, they don't know how to pick one thing from the next. They get caught up in somebody's thesis, and then I really don't know who they are, and they don't know what the story is in the end. So I basically tell them not to go to the library. I'm supposed to tell them to go to the library, you know what I mean? Well, now it's the internet, but whatever. I think we should feel free to look at that theme of home for our own purposes, to explore the role of the moral imagination in this particular classic of children's literature. As I say, each of the four main characters in Wind in the Willows can be identified with his dwelling or home and vice versa. We learn as much about the characters as their homes, really, when Grahame describes the dwelling. If it's not outright personification that he turns to, and in some cases he does, then it's implicit everywhere. So it's important to recognize as well that the happenings in these homes are important for the lives of the main characters in their lived friendships. I think the theme of home is very closely related to friendship in Wind in the Willows, and if anything that I would revise in my own thoughts about it in that chapter would probably be to say something like that more directly, although I remembered saying it pretty directly at the very end of my discussion when I pointed out the great importance for all of these characters in their friendship of Toad Hall. Toad Hall signifying their friendship in a very special sort of way. Not to say that they don't receive themselves into their other homes, whether it's badgers or moles or whatever. So for the balance of this talk, I don't know how long this will go on. I really, actually, at this point, I would say, when I start to talk about the two homes, you can raise your hand and ask me a question, as I've said to others, and I say to my classes. If I think it's going to help me to get through this, I will entertain the question. Otherwise, I'll tell you, let's get to it later. But I want to talk about the homes of Mole and Badger. The homes of Mole and Badger. And my aim is to take you right into the story by way of some wonderful passages. I read these over again this morning, and I kept saying to myself, really, do I have anything more to say about these passages than the passages say themselves? Probably not much. So you can help me. Maybe you have something to say about them. I was not in the mood this morning to dissect them. Chapter 5 of The Wind in the Willows has been received universally, I think, as one of the best chapters in the book. So chapters 5 and 6, rather. And so I will focus on chapter 6, which is titled, simply enough, Dolce Domum. Yeah. Home, sweet home. In his superior essays, there are good literary critics, mind you. W. Robeson, an English critic, observes that the rat-mole friendship is the basis for some of the finest and most sensitively observed things, and that Dolce Domum is a place where you can find this at work. It continues with its mingling of poignancy, comedy, and coziness. It tells the story of how the suddenly homesick mole is on the way home and begins to sense, homesick mole is suddenly persuaded by the tactful rat to give a Christmas party in his old home. How many of you have read A Wind in the Willows? Again, disproportionate. You are odd people, you know. The mole and the rat have been on one of their excursions, and they're on their way home, and it's turning to nighttime. There was no intention to go to Mole's house, but they pass by it, and in passing by it, Mole senses that he's near to a place that is dear to him, or that there's something calling him, at least. That's how it's set up. The notion of call in Wind in the Willows is very powerful. The characters are called to this, that, and another thing. Sometimes they're called to things that are good for them, and sometimes they're called to things that are not so very good for them. Toad seems to be called to mostly things that are not good for him. So he has to be, and this is Graham's terms, converted. Those are the words of the badger. Robeson writes that the theme of this chapter is a very old theme of literature. Here the old wine is poured into new bottles. And we are shown how human longing fuses. We are shown how the human longing works in a way that is not simply rational. And this may apply more to home than anything else. Not simply doesn't mean it's irrational. It just means that home cannot be captured simply by the rational mind. So here's the background. It's December, and Mole and Rat are returning to Rat's River home after one of their excursions in the countryside. The evening is cold, and as the two companions come to a village, they take a shortcut through it, feeling safe that it's at night and no one will be out, and they will not be detected. The two animals are then afforded a look into the lamp-lit homes of the human inhabitants. and evocative of the comfort and safety of being at home. Now, each time I read Wind in the Willows, and I read this chapter in particular, I have to stop with Ratty and Mole, because I can remember similar experiences in my own life, and I think most of you, if you're human beings, probably have them. Like riding up and down the East Coast on a train, and it's nighttime, and you can virtually peer into people's homes or apartments, and you wonder, what's going on there? How could there be so many things going on that I don't know? Really, seriously. And each of those going-ons is important for those people, and yet I don't know a thing about it. Right? But I sure would like to peer into just one of them and see what really is going on. This can happen on a car ride. It can happen on a stroll through a country town in the evening. It can happen in all sorts of places. Now, that's the beauty of this book, that he can capture something like that for us through these characters. I want to read at this point a couple of passages in which this occurs. And you can stop with them at the home that they stop at. It's a home with the blinds drawn and a view of a scene in silhouette of a bird in his cage, preparing, as no doubt the human inhabitants are. It seems to me this is a metaphor. Also doing the same to settle in for a good night's rest. I don't know that I'll comment on it after I read it, but you can if you like. They're walking through the village. I've been to England, so I can even imagine what that might be like. You know, English villages are not exactly American suburbia, though they're being overcome by English suburbia. But moving at will from one theater to another, the two spectators, so far from home themselves, had something of wistfulness in their eyes as they watched a cat being stroked, a sleepy child picked up and huddled off to bed, or a tired man stretch and knock out his pipe on the end of a smoldering log. But it was from one little window, with its blind drawn down, a mere blank transparency on the night, that the sense of home and the little curtained world within walls, the larger stressful world of outside nature shut out and forgotten, most pulsated. Close against the white blind hung a bird cage, clearly silhouetted, every wire, perch and appurtenance, distinct and recognizable, even to yesterday's dull-edged lump of sugar. On the middle perch, the fluffy occupant, head tucked well into feathers, seemed so near to them as to be easily stroked, had they tried. Even the delicate tips of his plumped-out plumage penciled plainly on the illuminated screen. And as they looked, the sleepy little fellow stirred uneasily, woke, shook himself, raised his head. They could see the gape of his tiny beak as he yawned in a bored sort of way, looked around, and then settled his head into his back again, while the ruffled feathers gradually subsided into perfect stillness, and then a gust of bitter wind took them in the back of the neck. A small sting of frozen sleet on the skin woke them as from a dream, and they knew that their toes to be cold, and their legs tired, and their own home distant, a weary way, Once beyond the village, where the cottages ceased abruptly, on the other side of the road, they could smell through the darkness the friendly fields again, and they braced themselves for the long stretch, the home stretch, the stretch that we know is bound to end sometime in the rattle of the door latch, the sudden firelight, and the sight of familiar things greeting us as long-absent travelers from far overseas. And that's beautiful. And I think we underestimate children's capacity to absorb that kind of prose, particularly in our day. Why we have to reduce the English language to 10 words, I don't know. I like declarative sentences, but a great writer can write a long sentence and still make sense. That's Henry James is a beautiful example of that. Or for that matter, well, I'm not so sure whether he always makes sense. William Faulkner. He writes sentences that are a couple of pages long. And if you don't know his dialect, I think it can get rather confounding. But if you know his dialect, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. So, there's a metaphor there. What a powerful metaphor. You know, it's a metaphor on top of a metaphor. We don't see directly into the house. We see it cast as a movie almost on a screen, you know, in shadow. And it makes it mysterious. It makes it that much more intriguing, right? Much more intriguing. And it emphasizes the mystery of life in the home. The very mystery which I spoke of when I said, I'm sitting on a train, looking out at all these lamplit windows along the way, wondering, what really is going on there? It's probably very important, but it's a mystery to me. All right? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? And if you do, just raise your hand. I haven't said all there is about it. I think it's brilliant, the way he uses metaphor here. It's really what T.S. Eliot called an objective correlative, an extended metaphor that evokes the emotion first and foremost. Yes.
As someone on the autism spectrum, I have experienced this a lot in my life and always assumed that it was something that just I felt, that I didn't understand other people and that I didn't understand other people's homes. So to see this extended metaphor of someone else describing exactly what I've been feeling is
wow.
A very powerful connection to other people for me.
Oh, thank you for that. I mean, that's really something, isn't it? That tells you something, doesn't it? Oh, that's fantastic. Someone over there? Oh, over here. Huh? Over here. Over. Oh, repeat what you said. Yes, stand up. Would you like the podium? What, you afraid of that? Okay, good.
I'm not afraid of that, but I don't know that.
Well, go ahead. Just stand up and speak directly to them. Yeah. Well, you don't. There's steps over there. Go ahead. Come on up here. That's it.
I'm sorry, I do have a quiet voice. I said that as someone on the autism spectrum, I grew up most of my life feeling like this. Anytime that I looked at other people and other people's families, that I did not understand what was going on in their heads, much less in their homes. So to hear this extended metaphor where someone very eloquently describes exactly what I've been feeling my entire life, it makes me feel very connected to other people, that obviously this isn't something that I experience by myself.
Well, what about children? You know, we underestimate a child if you, we think that they don't think such things, even at the ages of 3, 4, and 5. They do. They may not be able to articulate it, but I am quite confident they do. I have a precocious 5-year-old granddaughter who is so verbal that she actually does express it, you know. Not every child does that. I mean, sometimes I'm left in, you know, you probably have children in your life that are in utter shock, frankly. As her father said to me one time, she said, she's smarter than I am. I don't know what I'm going to do, you know. But all children are attentive to these things, even if they don't express them. And so for it to be verbalized for them is important. Yes.
Well, I was what might be in that description, seeing the movie of somebody else's family or home was a feeling of it also reflecting how we might feel in our own homes, like looking at ourselves, like what is when I'm there, like a reflection also of the mystery that we're in ourselves.
Yes. One more.
I don't have that question. It's just a personal experience of growing up in childhood. I grew up
Can you hear her? Stand up if you could. You don't have to come up here, but stand up. It'll help.
It's a personal experience of growing up in a city where it might be winter and you're walking through the dark lit, snowy night and you're seeing the windows lit up of the apartment complexes next to you and you're just really trying to peek behind the curtains and see them getting ready for the New Year's and you're just imagining what kind of presents they're laying down for their children or so I think that's kind of nostalgia or the reminiscence that it brought on.
Yeah. I think that, you know, we all have those moments, but I don't think we're given very many opportunities to actually admit to it, you know, or to say it. So Grahame says it for us. That's what he does. That's what a great writer really does. I want to go on a little bit because this is only the beginning of the journey home for Mole. It sets us up so that we are not surprised when it happens that Mole begins to understand what is calling him. It's home. That's what's calling him. And he grows frustrated. But the role of friendship plays into this in a very important way. Grahame writes, it was one of those mysterious fairy calls from out of the void that suddenly reached Mole in the darkness. Now Mole realizes that his old home, the home that meant so much to him, that he had abandoned, is calling him back. Now, most of you have read the book, so you may remember, this book begins at a home and ends at a home, which is not insignificant in and of itself. It begins at Mole's home, where Mole is what? Doing spring cleaning. And suddenly he gets this urge to go out into the world and to explore it a bit. And you wonder why he's so forgetful of it, you know, until this point. You say, this is unrealistic, bless you. Well, maybe not. Maybe he has thought about it, but it's at this point that out of his unconscious, maybe, his home comes into his mind, virtually smells his home, hears his home, calling him. And it's relentless. And Mole deeply wants to follow his nose to that place of his primal belonging. But there's his friendship and regard for Ratty's own desiring for his own home that stops him, silences him, until he can do nothing else but sit and cry. So the trope of home serves here to accent, it seems to me, the commitments, the relationship of friendship, you know, and the struggles that each of these characters go through to be true to that friendship, you know. And in this case, Mole is being called by something very primal, and yet he's aware that his friend Ratty wants to go home too. But he finally breaks down and he says, "Please stop, Ratty. You don't understand. It's my home, my old home. It's close by here." Now, Robson comments that what follows and is evoked is the beauty that can exist in a human relationship at a moment like this, the poignancy of it. It is, above all, he says, a matter of manners. And I think that's a really helpful insight. How we dispose ourselves to others in a way that we recognize their worth. That's what manners is about. You tip a hat because you're, I don't know when he tips a hat anymore. Hold a door, or whatever it might be for somebody. Do something like that. It's a gesture. But it's a gesture with intended meaning. It may be that words would not accomplish what the gesture can accomplish. Anyway, he writes, in Mole, it is the mixture of need to reproach a friend and anguish at that reproach that wrings the heart. It is moral fitness, he continues, in Rat that enables him to cheer up Mole and make him feel at home again in his old home. And if you know that story, you know Ratty goes through, does everything in his power to make Mole comfortable in his own home, because Mole is embarrassed by his home. It's rather small and incomplete and has been left for some time. And he's seen better things. And Ratty more than makes him feel at home again. They have a Christmas party. The mice come along and do their caroling and all sorts of wonderful images. So I think Robeson does capture the profound lesson of this chapter. And we really do learn much more about Ratty and Mole in this situation, so movingly invented by Grahame. But I would add, however, that the two of them also learn much about each other and the trust each can put in the other, that each will respect and honor the other when need arises. For Mole especially, there is the lesson learned, as Grahame so felicitously describes, that though Mole did not want to abandon the new life he had found, this visit home reminded him that home, his home, was a special anchor for all his doings. Or as Pascal Mercier has written, we leave something of ourselves behind when we leave a place. We stay there even though we go away. And there are things that we can find again only by going back home. And that's so for Mole. It's a moment in his maturation that actually prepares him for the conclusion of the book, where he comes up with an interesting plan that works, so that the four friends can recapture Toad Hall. But I want to. When does this end? Pretty soon, doesn't it? No? How much? 11? Oh, I got 10 minutes. Okay. I want to read this. I'm not going to get through this, mind you. The advantage of teaching in a classroom is you can do it next time, but it doesn't work here. Anyway, I wanted to read just from, let's see, why do I have 95, 96? That's not right, is it? Let me see something. Let me read first from page 79 of my text. Home. That was what they meant, those caressing appeals, those soft touches wafted through the air, those invisible little hands pulling and tugging all one way. Why, it must be quite close by him at that moment, his old home, that he had hurriedly forsaken and never sought again that day when he first found the river. And now it was sending out its scouts and its messengers to capture him and bring him in. since his escape on that bright morning, he had hardly given a thought. So absorbed had he been in his new life, in all its pleasures, its surprises, its fresh and captivating experience. Now, with a rush of old memories, how clearly it stood before him in the darkness. And then the end of the chapter I just wanted to read to you, and then you can maybe have something to say about it. I'm not even going to get the badgers home. The end of the chapter. All the festivities have ended. Great cheer, Christmas time, and all the rest of it. I know that I feel very strongly that C.S. Lewis stole at least the what's the word I want, the spirit of this chapter in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when those animals first, the Narnians first encounter the Father Christmas has come. Wind in the Willows was C.S. Lewis's most favorite book for children. That's not to say that everything he said about George MacDonald isn't true, but his most favorite story was The Wind in the Willows. They're going to go to bed. It's time to go to bed, like all those people in those homes that they passed in the village. The weary mole also was glad to turn in without delay, and soon his head fell on his pillow in great joy and contentment. But ere he closed his eyes, he let them wander round his old room, mellow in the glow of the firelight that played or rested on familiar and friendly things, which had long been unconsciously a part of him, and now, smiling, received him back. Without rancor. He was now in just the frame of mind that the tactful rat had quietly worked to bring about in him. He saw clearly how plain and simple, how narrow even, it all was. But clearly, too, how much it all meant to him, and the special value of such anchorage in one's existence. He did not at all want to abandon the new life and its splendid spaces, to turn his back on sun and air and all they offered him, and creep home and stay there. The upper world was all too strong. It called him still, even down there, and he knew that he must return to the larger stage. But it was good to think he had this to come back to, this place which was all his own, these things which were so glad to see him again, and could always be counted upon for the same simple welcome. Again, high prose, but children can get it. They know that home is a place of safety, rest, joy, comfort, and as much as they want to learn the rest of the world, they know they can come back to home. Right? Any thoughts? I think I'm not going to take you any further. Too bad.